Okay, so thank you everyone for coming and welcome to this evening's event. We're very pleased and fortunate to have with us today Dr. Michael Gow from Edge Hill University in Ormskirk, Lancashire, who's come via a complex train journey on a day with lots of disruptions, as I'm afraid tomorrow will be also, all the way from Liverpool to Cambridge to present for us this evening. Mike completed his undergraduate work at Nottingham Trent University and then both a master's and PhD at the University of Bristol, after which he worked at a variety of institutions, including New York University, Xi'an Liverpool University, and Coventry University, if I've got everything right in my mind, and has for the last 4.5 years, been at Edge Hill. And today he's going to talk to us on some very interesting and exciting new research on corporate socialist responsibility and the relationship between the state and businesses in China. So, Mike, go ahead.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. So, thanks everybody for coming along today. I have made some typically sort of red propaganda style sort of PowerPoint presentations, because that's what you have to do when you study anything to do with contemporary China. So what I'm going to be talking about today, this is not research that is by any means complete and well formed. There are lots of threads to research that I've been doing throughout my PhD, looking at the role of higher education in state building projects during the Hu Jintao administration, so from 2002 to 2012. And then since 2012, trying to understand the role of other parts of the non-state sector. So looking at cultural industries, looking at things like the medium to long-term football development plan and how this relates to state building projects, looking at things like red tourism. And one thing that keeps sort of coming up and coming back to me is that is the role of the private sector and how the private sector is mobilized in service of state projects. And it's very similar to my early sort of development of my PhD project, where I originally submitted a proposal where I was going to look at the marketing of higher education in China. And after spending a bit more time out in China, I realized that this is pointless because it's not actually a market. Higher education is still very tightly controlled through the Ministry of Education, but also through the provincial municipal education bureaus in China. So it's a very sort of tightly monitored system. And the questions I started asking about higher education became very, very different, much more trying to understand the context itself. Sort of realization that before I can understand what Britain's doing in China's higher ed sector, I need to understand more about China's higher education sector. Unfortunately, I had a wonderful supervisor who introduced me to some very interesting theoretical frameworks, particularly Gramsci and the work of Robert Cox. I think it was the first books that I was given. And this sort of opened my eyes to help me think about these issues in a very, very different way. But what I've become increasingly interested in since 2012 is and this comes from living in China. So I lived in China really for most of the time. The couple of years back in the UK, splintered in between for masters and early PhD. But pretty much since 2004 to 2018, I was pretty much in China for most of that time. So from 2009 through to 2018, I was there permanently. So, and a lot of the things that I became interested in weren't necessarily encountered through scholarship. They were encountered through just being in China and seeing things that you just think, what the hell's going on here? What does all this mean? So, and I'm going to introduce you to some of those things in this talk. So, as I say, this is not a finished article by any stretch of the imagination. It's more a sort of look at certain threads that I'm beginning to think, rather than just could be sort of individual papers or things that I could explore through journal articles, might be weaved together into something a bit more coherent. So I'd be very interested to know what everybody thinks about this and any sort of constructive criticism or any comments at all, more than welcome. So what I'm going to try and do, and this is just a sort of brief look at the talk. I'm going to try and get through this first part anyway as quickly as possible. I thought I'd bring in some context. So I'm going to look at corporate social responsibility of CSR and the conventional wisdom that we approach this in Western business schools, as it were. So that's my straw man that I'm going to just demolish immediately with regards to China. And then I think an important thing is to look at Xi Jinping's new era, but also how it contrasts and how it's positioned within what has been referred to as the 4 epochs of the CCP since about November 2021, since the 3rd historical resolution. So I'll explain all about these things and then looking at Xi Jinping's new era, what the key characteristics of this are, and some of the previous research I've done on core socialist values, and why this is an important sort of, I wouldn't say just propaganda campaign, but an actual sort of central pillar of Xi Jinping's superstructural reforms in China. And what I shall I say this now? No, I'll come to this later, this sort of key point. And then I'm going to introduce this idea of what I'm provisionally calling a corporate state apparatus. So one of the things that I think is absolutely fascinating about China, contemporary China, is, yes, if we go back and look at those old Thessarian terms, so we've got the repressive state apparatus, the ideological state apparatus, but really China's, is it the first instance where we see a sort of post-socialist, is it post-socialist, but a post-socialist nation with a well-developed economy and something that is becoming a sort of an emergent consumer culture that's happening in China. And this is actually quite an important question due to the nature of the problems that's facing Xi Jinping's administration. Gone are the days of double-digit economic growth and what they call this performance legitimacy of the state. And this seems to me to be a central motivation behind a sort of range of Xi Jinping's policies. So I'll try and get into that. But what I'm going to start off with is CSR. And as I said, it's a bit of a straw man, this, but I think it's kind of important to look at. So there's generally, and this necessarily is a very sort of simplistic view of CSR. It's not going to go into a huge amount of detail. But there's pretty much 2 schools of thought. So we've got this guy who we love to hate in the north of England, anybody that's in that sort of Friedman-esque, Milton Friedman school of economics, argues that corporations should not concern themselves with anything other than making a profit, bottom line. They deliver benefit to society precisely because that's what they do. Then we have sort of emerging in the 70s. So the Friedman doctrine was actually, I think it emerged in the early 70s in a New York Times or Wall Street Journal article that was published by Friedman. And he's saying, we shouldn't care about any other stakeholders. We should focus purely and solely on the bottom line. Then we get Robert Freeman, and he comes along and he says, well, money is just really, it's like blood flowing through a business, and the business is a corporate citizen. It's not enough just to survive. You've got to actually make a contribution to the society that you exist in. So it introduces this idea that we need to consider other stakeholders, not just stockholders or shareholders, right? So pretty 2 sort of schools of thought. And actually, I mean, I've always sort of erred more on this side, but recently there's been a few cases, prominent cases, where I'm beginning to think Friedman might have had a point. So I don't know if you've come across these cases. So there's a company called Theranos. Has anybody heard of Theranos? Yeah, so this is the company set up by an entrepreneur, a Stanford dropout. Why are they always dropouts? I don't know. They always seem to want to be a sort of dropout. So Elizabeth Holmes set up this company and created this machine called an Edison, which allegedly could do blood tests at home and test for a number of different conditions. It was effectively... It was the import of the Silicon Valley, fake it till you make it, into the medical sector, which brings all sorts of sort of moral complications with it. Turns out the machine didn't work, it was a big fraud. The company was at one point valued $9 billion. And then this is relevant, by the way, to the CSR. And then we get, does anybody recognize what this might be? So this is Sam Bankman-Fried. So he's a crypto entrepreneur, and has recently been found guilty of wire fraud and a number of other offences in a New York court for defrauding investors, basically. And he's famous for having this approach and this sort of philosophy that underpinned his business model called effective altruism. So this idea, which is kind of, it seems to me like a bit like Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth on steroids. But it's effectively the same argument. It's okay for people to make as much money and to make obscene amounts of money as long as they give that back to society. It's an argument that could only really be written by a billionaire, basically. So we got this thing here, and going back to these arguments with this guy, what Friedman isn't saying is he's not really sort of saying companies shouldn't care and just be sociopaths. What he's saying is the only reason you should do something is if there's an economic interest for the company and it increases the bottom line. So if your customers are actually saying, you know, we want to buy products that are more sustainably produced, then there's an economic argument for you to build that into your strategy. So I think Friedman's a bit misunderstood. But what these sort of highlight, well, what I find fascinating about these case studies, is these companies, they became worth billions and billions of dollars. And the reason it was allowed to get to that stage was because people were not looking at the bottom line. They were focused on doing good for society. And this allowed the sort of frauds to snowball, basically, because people were saying, you know, we want to do good, therefore we'll keep pushing, we'll keep pushing, we'll keep pushing. So I'm sort of very interested in these sort of contemporary debates around CSR. You know, should we focus on bottom line? Should we make a larger contribution to society? But when it comes to contemporary China, this is not the debate that's going on. We have this sort of idea of free markets and that the markets should be separate from the state. And companies essentially have a huge amount of autonomy within that closed system. You know, free markets are not natural. They are created by regulation, right? And once you create that sort of regulated market, companies that Friedman is sort of talking about then have a huge amount of autonomy within that sort of regulated framework to act however they want. But in China, that doesn't seem to be the discussion that's taking place. What we've seen is that there's a very different emphasis. And this was something that really became apparent to me when I interviewed the president of a university in 2012. And in China, it was very late on. It was probably only about 4 months before I submitted my PhD. And this president of the university, I'd gone back to interview him again, and in this final interview, he really sort of opened up and started telling me some things that were really interesting. And what he said was, look, what you've got to understand about Chinese universities is, the way we look at it is, in the West, if you work at a university, your job is to show the world how smart you are. Our job in Chinese universities is to deliver to the 5-year plan objectives of whichever jurisdiction we're under. So if you're a national university, it's the Ministry of Education. If you're under the Ministry of Science and Technology, you've got to feed in your research and expertise to that. If you're under the provincial or municipal, Shanghai Municipal Education Commission, you've got to understand what their priorities are, and you've got to develop degree programs that deliver graduates to those industries and this type of thing. So it's not about showing us how smart we are at university, it's showing us about how we contribute to the national development goals. And we see a very similar thing with CSR discourse in China. It's not about, you know, who decides what's good is not the companies. They don't have that autonomy. So this is something that I've been wanting to explore a bit further. So when it comes to sort of conventional theory on CSR, this is a very simple, but I think quite elegant sort of model. And what Carroll says here with this CSR pyramid is that first responsibility of a company is to remain profitable going concern. If it goes bankrupt, it's no use to anybody, right? It's actually maybe a drain on on the local community and other stakeholders. So we have to make a profit. Once we start making a profit, then we need to make sure we're legally compliant, that we're not putting our shareholders' investments at risk through being taken to civil or criminal courts, this type of thing. So we have to follow and make sure that we're legally compliant. Only then, only once we've ticked these two boxes, can we even worry about starting being more ethical, whether that's developing new sustainability initiatives, environmental initiatives, whether it's improving our policies towards inclusivity, diversity, these types of things. We can't even think of doing this until we are economically profitable and we are legally compliant. And then after we've made some effort to show that we're an ethical company, that the core part of our business is being conducted as ethically as possible with as many stakeholders in mind, then we can start looking at what we call philanthropic initiatives, which are usually, it seems to be quite poorly defined what the difference is here between ethical and philanthropic, but philanthropic seems to be initiatives that are outside the remit of the business. So for example, Bill Gates giving money to try and clear malaria infections in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a philanthropic because that's not really what Microsoft's core business is. So this is the sort of conventional sort of theory, or a simplified version of that. But as I say, this seems to be what's happening in China in the contemporary era. But CSR is being talked about. 企业社会责任, I think is the form, and we start seeing it becoming very prominent around 2014, 2015, 2016. We start seeing a lot of editorials in places like Qiushi, the theoretical journal of the Communist Party, Dangjian, but we also see it in a lot of discussion and discourse around this. It tends to die off a little bit later on, maybe around 2020. But there's a lot of discussion going on around what is a good corporate citizen? That seems to be the discussion that's going on in those sort of journals. But to understand this, I think what I'm going to do for context is come back and have a look, just very briefly, at how we've got to the Xi Jinping era and maybe look at some of the characteristics of that. So, we have these leaders, 1949 to present. So we have Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping. And back in November 2021, there was what we called the third historical resolution of the CCP. There have been two previously, one in 1945 and one in 1981. And then we got one in 2021. And these actually have divided the party, although there's three of them, divided the history of the party into 4 epochs. And this is something that I picked up, not necessarily from People's Daily or anything like that, but after the historical resolution, in this era of what's called sort of wolf warrior diplomacy, the ambassadors of all the embassies, PRC embassies around the world, they all have very active Twitter accounts. And there seemed to be a very consistent message going out through announcements on the embassy websites that there are now 4 epochs. It's not 3 eras of the CCP, it's actually 4. So let's have a look at these. So they divided them, China before the establishment of the PRC. So the first era of the CCP, China and Revolution, 21 to 49. So established in 21, then we get to 49. Then the People's Republic of China under Chairman Mao from 49 to 76 is the second epoch. Then we have Deng Xiaoping's opening and reform. 78, is it 78? Is it 79? Is it 80, 81? There's a bit of discussion. For argument's sake, I've just put 78 to 2012 there. And then we have from 2012 to present, this is Xi Jinping's new era. And from what we can see is that this is going to last until 2049, which is the second of the 2 centenary goals. The centennial of the founding of the People's Republic of China will be in 2049. So these are the 4 epochs. In terms of leadership, we've got Mao becomes leader becomes sort of supreme leader, I think is probably a better phrase, in 1927. We see the PRC founded, then we have the death of Mao in 76. Deng emerges around 78, 79. There was a sort of interregnum with Hua Guofeng, was Mao's anointed successor. Then after the Tiananmen incident, we see Jiang Zemin from 1989 to 2002, Hu Jintao 2002-2012, and then Xi from 2012 onwards. And the historical resolutions came at very key points, and they serve a very specific function in Chinese politics, these documents. They serve, we often hear the criticisms of revisionists and historical nihilists. But these documents are essentially a revision of what's gone before into an official history. I think that's a good way of looking at them. So with the defeat of the Japanese and the emergence of the CCP and the sort of retaking of hostilities with the Kuomintang, we see the first CCP historical resolution, which really cements Mao's place as supreme leader of the CCP. We then see the second CCP historical resolution, and what this does is this serves to draw a line in the sand after Mao. It doesn't criticize Mao directly, it criticizes the Gang of Four, who were just done, so that's Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, and three other senior politburos that were in charge over the Cultural Revolution. And it sort of revises that history. It kind of says Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong, and that's where this document comes from. It also kind of signals what Gramsci would call a passive revolution. This is what the party needed to do to maintain its dominance and maintain its power. It had to change something. The country was really on its knees at this point. You speak to anybody that sort of lived through this, family members on my wife's side family, I've spoken to quite a lot of elderly relatives. And they kind of had mixed feelings about it, but I remember asking one, and he just said, how cool. Life before the opening reformers, how cool. Bitter, just bitter. Just a really sort of simple phrase that kind of captured, and the way that it was said as well, was just sort of reinforced how difficult things were before the opening and reform. And then we have this third CCP historical resolution, and this seems to be intended to do the same as the second, to draw a line in the sand between Deng's opening and reform era, the era of Deng, Jiang, and Hu, and to say that the country is now going in a new direction. So the question is what is that direction? I've tried to sort of draw up a few things here that we can sort of look at. So we have, essentially, if we have a look at these sort of key features down here, and this is just thinking, okay? It's not sort of taken from any sort of sources or lit sources or anything. But we seem to have the sort of key features of the sort of Mao era as sort of focus on ideology, on personality cult, perpetual revolution, revolutionary spirit, and the populism of Mao. It seemed to be ideologically driven and requiring sort of loyalty, and there was a lot of sort of factional sort of rivalries going on in that time. What we see the emphasis going on under Deng, and I've argued this in a think tank piece I wrote a couple of years ago, is that we're kind of coming to the view now that the reform and opening was not a liberalizing in China. It was never a sort of relinquishing of socialism. It was never a sort of, this yellow river capitalism that's eventually going to lead to democratization and this type of thing. There's been a kind of sort of reassessment of that in Chinese scholarship. But certainly the purpose seems to be to develop China's means of production, right? It's to develop the economy and to develop the wealth of the country. So to build a wealthy People's Republic of China. So that if, as and when they do move to socialism, there's stuff to share, there's actually things to share around. And what I've sort of argued is it seems to me that Deng actually is a move back to orthodox Marxism, getting away from Mao's great leap from agrarianism straight to communism. Deng comes back and says, no, what we need to do first is go and build the capitalist means of production before we can then socialize those means of production, before we can then nationalize them under communism. So, but the key goal here is growth, economic growth and enrichment. And what we see in 2008 is we start seeing a tailing off after the financial crisis. We start seeing a tailing off of double-digit growth. And that quid pro quo between the Chinese people and the party state, that we will not get political, as long as these opportunities to get wealthy keep coming along, this starts diminishing. And it seems to me that this is a sort of defining characteristic of this separation between the Reform era and the New era. The Reform era is about creating a wealthy country. The New era is about creating citizens for that country. And that is why I think the emphasis we see is on morality. We see a lot of emphasis on core values. We see a lot of emphasis on CSR and good citizenship. We see anti-corruption campaigns purging corrupt party members, whether that's a politically motivated against rivals or not. We can argue the case, but there's certainly been a major campaign within a morality campaign within the party itself. And it seems, it sort of bringing in nationalism and patriotism and these sorts, what are these ideas that are going to bind us together as a people and as a nation state? So there was a professor I was talking to, it's actually a wedding up in Beijing, and one of the person who was getting married was working in the NGO Institute at Tsinghua University. And he said something just in a passing sort of comment, and he said, we know what we're not. We know everybody up until Xi Jinping came along was saying, we don't want to be American. But what Xi Jinping's asking is, what does it mean to be Chinese in the world today? What does the party think it means to be Chinese? What does the party want Chinese identity to be sort of centered around? So this is something that I think is central to my understanding of the distinction between these two eras. So I'm going to have to sort of speed up a bit here. So Xi Jinping's new era kicks off 2012. He stands up in November 2012 and starts talking about the Zhongguomeng, the Chinese dream. It's referenced in his inaugural speech at the 18th Party Congress. And then almost immediately, by certainly early 2013, we start seeing these anti-corruption campaigns kicking into gear under, I think, is it Wang Qishan at this point? Was head of the Jiwei, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. And, a lot, I remember, because I just started my postdoc at NYU Shanghai in August 2013, and there was still a huge amount of optimism that Xi was going to be a liberalizing reformer. But this was very rapidly diminishing. It became very clear within the first 12 months of his taking over, maybe not as party, but after the March, the two meetings in March, it became very, very clear that this guy was not really interested in turning Chinese into an electoral democracy, shall we say. A lot of people were very surprised, myself included as well. Didn't realize how quickly it would go. And what we see what I see emerging probably 2013, 2014, 2015, is I start seeing this sort of imagery around. This is a famous poster of the core socialist values. And obviously in China, it didn't have the English translations on it. So, I don't know, it's a bit pixelated, this. So, what it is it's called the 24个字, the 社会主义核心价值观. So, the 24 characters of the core socialist values. And there are 12 core socialist values, each have 2 characters, because they're 24 characters. And we have 4 at the national level, 4 at the societal level, and 4 at the citizenship level. So what China wants is it wants a country, a nation that is prosperous, democratic, civilized and harmonious. When they say democratic, not electoral democracy, I think it's sort of democratic centralist, where the achievements of the nation are the democratic achievements of the people coming together to work towards those. They want a society that is free, equal, that has justice and rule of law. Again, the semantics of these and what they actually mean by that. We're talking socialist rule of law. A lot of people insist it's rule by law, not rule of law. But they've translated it in these terms. These are official translations. And then citizens who are patriotic, dedicated, who have integrity and are amiable or friendly. And this is what they want to see. I was looking at this stuff because I was cycling past it on the way to work, and every construction site in China, if they don't sell the advertising space, they have to give them over to the local propaganda department to put up the posters on. It's a kind of sort of regulation. There's never any sort of advertising space left free. So we see lots of these sorts of posters, and lots of them are traditional artwork. They were, what struck me was I kept seeing the same characters everywhere, written in lots of different artistic styles, but none of them had any communist sort of imagery on them. But then in the bottom, you would usually see something like the, I think it's Xinshi is the, there's a body within the CCP about building a spiritual civilization. So we know that these messages were from the propaganda department, basically. But there was no sort of, they were very soft. They seemed a bit more sophisticated in the message that they were giving across. And this one, I thought it was something to do with environmental sort of campaigns until I actually looked at it a bit closer and realized, no, it's a propaganda campaign from the state. And this is something that we start seeing discussed. And we see Xi Jinping expressing this ambivalence towards the West and towards Western countries. It's almost sort of a jealous looking at it, saying that the real important thing, the reason that we can have electoral democracy and change our government every 5 years is because our values permeate those institutions. And there's a sort of large consent to those values, right? But he may want that stability, but he doesn't want the Western values that sort of convey that stability. He wants the stability, but a distinctly and uniquely, specifically Chinese set of values, or what the Communist Party is deemed to be Chinese values. So this is quite early on. This is it's from a speech. It's not The Governance of China. There was another book published around the same time that has a lot of speeches, and almost all of them, there's some mention of this sort of emphasis on values that Xi Jinping is talking about. So just park that here for the moment, and I'm going to move on to sort of this idea I mentioned earlier about repressive apparatus. So just to sort of refresh memory here, so the repressive state apparatus is the arena in which coercion takes place. So if you step out of line, if you break a law, if you break regulations, the party is, or the state, and it doesn't matter whether it's China or whether it's anywhere else, is going to have to engage in some disciplining. So the institutions of the repressive state apparatus, we have the legislature, the People's Court, the Procuratorate, the Public Security Bureau, which are the standard police, the People's Armed Police, which is a sort of military force for domestic incidents, the PLA, and then we have these two organizations. So the CCDI is the party's internal police force, and the National Supervision Commission is something that's been set up about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, which kind of expands the remit of that to look at public employees. So the CCDI, the distinction is CCDI really only discipline party members. The National Supervision Commission, anybody who is misbehaving in public office, who may or may not be a party member. So this is the repressive state apparatus. We then have the ideological state apparatus, the compulsory education system, schools, colleges, media. Trade unions I've put in there. They might belong in the next one because all trade unions are under the party, they're not independent. But we also have independent media, state-approved institutions, and I've put the Young Patriots and Communist Youth League in here as well, because these are sort of institutions where, it's certainly the Young Patriots, every child up to the age of 16, I think, is a member of the Young Patriots in China, which is the school compulsory education age children's Communist Party arm, and then the Youth League, which is on campuses. And these seem to be, you know, sort of institutions for training and sort of not necessarily becoming a party member. Not everybody that's in these obviously then goes on to become a full party member. And then I've come up with this idea that I've been toying around with for a while, which is, and I'm not sure whether this is right, I originally started looking at advertising, and I'm going to show you a few of these things in a moment, where I was calling it the consumer state apparatus, or consumerism seems to be a very powerful a very powerful way of communicating and reinforcing the sort of state vision. So, but it's a bit nuanced as to how it works. So I'll come to that in a second. But actually, I think it's wider than that. When you look at the way that the party state tries, what it doesn't allow is grassroots culture to sort of move up from the bottom. Everything is a top-down imposed cultural industry. So we see things like, I'd say, tourism, music, arts, sports. So you look at football, for example. Football, they have what's called the medium to long-term football development plan. But the amount of state organs that are involved in planning this is incredible. And what they seem to do is allocate resources where private sector players come in and compete over those. And that pushes the whole sector along a trajectory that the state wants. They don't tell the private sector what to do. They distribute resources that creates this kind of building competition. And as long as some people succeed, it will push the industry in that direction. So if we look at football, which is run into massive problems, I know, at the moment. There's actually a former player of my favourite team, Everton, is currently looking at 20 years in prison. Li Tie, he's been found guilty of embezzlement and lots of crimes at the top of the Chinese FA. He was recently on TV giving a forced confession on Chinese state television. So the football dream, as it were, has maybe sort of died, but the way that it was brought about is still very relevant to look at. So 2016 to 2020, this is where we see massive amounts of investment going into particularly elite level football. But who's doing this? It's not the state that's doing it. The state is creating that sort of environment, that sort of terrain. And it's companies like Wanda, it's companies like Honda, Evergrande, who've recently been told that they have to file for bankruptcy by a Hong Kong court. Massive, massive problems. It's companies like Suning. The team that I used to follow in China was Jiangsu Suning. They won the title in 2020, and then they went bankrupt, and the club no longer exists. It was liquidated. So which just absolutely sort of mercurial rise and fall going on there. And there just seemed to be this huge sort of mass acquisition run amongst these private companies. They were very, very quickly mobilized to try and serve these state goals. So the distinction, though, here is that this seems to me where people can visibly perform their role as a good citizen, where corporations can show that they are good citizens, that they are contributing to the state's goals, this type of thing. So that's kind of the sort of theory I'm trying to sort of, it's a bit difficult to pin down, but that's what I'm attempting to do with this. So I'm going to give you some sort of admittedly anecdotal kind of examples about the types of things that we're sort of looking at and seeing. So the first thing that I want to say is go back to the core socialist values. The conduct of business people, of entrepreneurs, has to align with this. And if it doesn't, well, what happens? Well, there's a very good example. Does anybody know who this company, ByteDance, or this person, Zhang Yiming? Has anybody heard of him? I'm getting some nods, I'm getting some shaking of heads. So ByteDance, Zhang Yiming, I think he's now number 3 on the Hurun rich list. He's a very, very wealthy man. He stepped down as CEO of ByteDance after a scandal several years ago. And he had, the company was famous for 2 apps. One was called Douyin. I can't remember the name of the other one. It was a news service. And they got into a lot of trouble because the content that was going out through the news service was not reflecting the core socialist values. And Zhang Yiming disappeared for a few days, and then he emerged giving a bit of a sort of confession. I can't remember, was it TV or was it a sort of written statement where he said that ByteDance would be reviewing its internal procedures to ensure that all the content that goes out through its platforms will reflect and uphold the core socialist values. So there's a very clear sort of political instruction that's gone on here. The reason it's important is one of the news app was actually removed and has never returned. So they were basically killed half the business of ByteDance at that time. But the other app, Douyin, is better known as TikTok in this country. So in China, they still refer to it as Douyin. but it's the same app, but it's kind of ring-fenced outside China and inside China. They're the content's actually very different as well, I think. So we get these examples. We get examples of very prominent CEOs being hauled into line. We also see other examples with Jack Ma Yun. Particularly, that seems to me something that's related to the Evergrande sort of crisis. He invested a significant amount of money in Evergrande, and about 8 months later, his Ant Financial IPO was pulled. So some really interesting sort of things going on in that. But these entrepreneurs, these prominent entrepreneurs, they are being corralled by the state, basically, in terms of these things. The other way that this is happening is through regulation. So ByteDance just last week hired another 4,000 people to censor content on their platform to make sure that it's in line with what is acceptable by the state. And I don't know if they're ever given any red lines. It's kind of a sort of grey area, and they've got to be overly cautious to make sure that they don't overstep the mark. So they sort of overcompensate for these types of things. The other sort of thing that we see with entrepreneurs and companies, and this is a separate anecdotal example, is we see a lot of philanthropic endeavours that are geared towards state policies. So one of she's key economic policy at the moment is common prosperity. And what we see is a lot of companies, so this is from Shanghai Dazhong. Is it Shanghai Dazhong? Shanxi Dazhong? Yeah, so this is Shanghai Dazhong, the joint venture between Shanghai Automobiles and Volkswagen. And they start talking about party building culture and propaganda work, where they are helping to spread the message of the party through their philanthropic endeavors, including scholarships and training centers and this type of thing. We also see examples such as this, the Pinghu Qingtian model in Zhejiang, where we're looking at companies, CCP members, banks, enterprises donating in order to help poorer people in rural areas become shareholders in these sort of initiatives. So, and this is something that we're seeing a lot of. Increasingly, when companies are setting up, we've seen a recent development between Tencent, Tongxun, and I think it was China Unicom, where I think it's about 10 or 15% of the shares had to be held by the employees. There's a socializing of wealth here. So that term socialism, or what's been socialized, it's the means of production. They become more owned by the workers and therefore and not a sort of capitalist elite. So we're seeing little initiatives like this getting a huge amount of coverage in official party publications like People's Daily, like Qiushe, like Dangjian, Red Flag Journal, this type of stuff. So this is an interesting thing. And these philanthropic things are not driven by the entrepreneur's interests. They almost always align to a key government policy at the time. Whether it's poverty alleviation, whether it's common prosperity, whether it's training programs to instill the core socialist values as part of the company's identity, this type of thing. We see a lot of this stuff going on as well. I'll skip past this next slide. That's something. So we have a look at I think I've talked about this already, but this is the sort of football plan. This is from a paper I published with John Sullivan and Simon Chadwick a few years back. What we just went through the 2016 to 2015 development plan and identified these 21 different national plan objectives. The ones that were scheduled for 2020, that was in the early stage of the football plan, where it says sustained, they will either be achieved in the medium or to the long-term sort of part of the plan. And as you can see, we've got a fostering of football culture across China. Now that might seem sort of kind of a generic thing, but if you go to a football match in China, you'll notice that there's sort of supporting goes on in a certain way, okay? It's not like going to see, I don't know, Stoke versus Oxford on a miserable Thursday night. There's not lots of drunken people throwing pies at each other and this type of stuff. It's a sort of very nice, regimented, sort of sanitized kind of football environment that's going on. Even the players, if they have any tattoos, have to wear coverings. They're not allowed to play showing any visible tattoos, this type of stuff. There's the regulations all in terms of the sport. So you see a lot of orchestrated stuff, and it's interesting because these are the fans finding ways to get around the regulations. You know, right, we're told that we can't celebrate in a sort of boisterous way, so how can we do it in a way that we're not going to get into trouble? And they end up coming up with these sort of choreographed goal celebrations and all this type of stuff. It's really interesting. This picture, I think, is from Evergrande. It's a Chinese national game, but actually, if you look in the crowd on the larger image, there's Hongda is the Evergrande team. So this is Guangzhou. So we see a lot of objectives, but we also see a massive amount of ministries, Supreme Court. They're creating insurance industries. One of the biggest problems that they faced getting football played in schools is that the schools won't allow kids to play football because they're scared of being sued by the parents if the kid gets injured playing. So they've had to effectively build an entire insurance industry so that schools can insure campus football leagues so that the schools can't be sued by the parents. And there's all these little things that are really sort of interesting. So, and you know, we see a lot of private sector being mobilized. They see opportunities here. They see, you know, they see opportunities to make money, and they sort of compete after that. And what this does is it drives this whole project along, or it was up until about 2020, 2021. Okay, so that's I'm going to go too much more detail with that. Another area that I have looked at and published, again, a think tank piece on was looking at red tourism. And this was born of a couple of experiences I had towards my end of my time in China in 2017, 2018. And I was looking at red tourism. Now, a lot of people look at this. There's a huge amount of really interesting scholarship out there on red tourism. What is it? How is it being built? Where's it being built? All this type of stuff. But when I was taken on some of these tours, well, not taken on some of these tours, it's actually happened in a different way. I noticed something when I went to Guilin, to Yangshuo, and I stayed in the Shangri-La. Okay, really nice 5-star hotel. It was my mum's 60th birthday, so about 2011 this was. And she'd always wanted to go there and see Zhang Yimou's impressions on Liu Sanjie. So there's a big open-air performance by Zhang Yimou, who's a film director who famously directed the opening sequences at the Beijing Olympics. Right? So it's, if you imagine the Beijing Olympic opening ceremony, it's a bit like that, but it's in this lovely sort of, it's on this lake with these karst peaked on cliffs and stuff. So we went to see this, but it was a sort of week-long trip that we went on, and there were just some encounters that happened there that were just really sort of on my eyes, right, what's going on here? Is this people, when we say red tourism, what we tend to think is the party is telling people to go away and learn about the history of the party and to become a bit more sort of, you know, sort of patriotic and ideological and this type of thing. And this is not what is going on at all at these red tourism sites. So give you an idea of how much this has sort of expanded. There are a number of these sort of national major centres for red tourism, and you'll have some sort of flagship sort of sites for people to bury. But they've got these sort of networks of areas around, and they all have themes. So Shanghai Zhejiang Red Tourist Area, this is mainly in Shanghai, breaking new ground, founding of the CCP. So the place where the first CCP Congress is actually in Xintiandi. It's one of the most developed sort of. Xintiandi itself is a sort of monument to capitalism, really. It's just Starbucks everywhere and this type of thing, right? It's actually invested by, I think, a lot of Hong Kong and Taiwanese entrepreneurs in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. But it's also the site of the first CCP Congress. So we get a lot of stuff around there. And you have a lot of these tours that are organized that will hit Shanghai and Zhejiang, maybe go down to Shaoxing, see the Home Revolution, you know, all of these types of things as well. And they'll visit multiple sites. So there's quite a lot of these around the country. So I had a look at, these seem to be the main ones. But actually, when you look at a map, we plan these out. These are official red tourist sites, and there's been a very, very clear and concerted effort to make sure that there's a balance right around the country in all provinces. So we have a huge number of these. And what you have sprouting up around these are sort of mini cottage industries, tour guides. You have sort of local, tangible culture, crafts, food, all this type of stuff. But when people go on these, I always sort of have this assumption, like, why would anybody, okay, you maybe go and learn about the history of the nation and this type of thing. But actually, when you go and visit some of these sites, you're not encountering people. That's not why they're there. They're not there because of any sort of political kind of allegiance. This is a £5,900 RMB a month tour. 5,900 RMB per person tour that takes in some key scenic areas, but also the Martyrs Cemetery in Jingangshan in Jiangxi province. So this is a sort of key site of party history. And what we see on this is that the people are going on these sites. And by the way, 50% of the market for this is people between the age of 18 and 35. This is not old. This is a lot of people, a lot of young people who are the tourists. I think 18 to 24-year-olds is about 20% or 22%, and then 28% according to the latest figures that I've seen. And what they're doing is they're networking. Yes, they get to go around and learn about this stuff, and that's a form of sort of cultural capital. If you say to somebody, have you been to the Martyrs at Jingangshan? Oh, it's way better than the Yan'an Soviet. This seems to be something that becomes a form of cultural capital and knowledge that kind of conveys a sort of sense of, it sort of consecrates them as a good citizen. If you know about these things, if you've been to these areas. But also what they're doing is they're staying in 5-star hotels. They're staying in the Howard Johnson suites. They're staying in, the Ramada Plaza in Nanchang. They are networking with other fuardai, other wealthy second-generation young people, and they're meeting lots of people so there's social capital. This is why people are going on these things. It's a really sort of interesting dynamic that we see, where people are consuming the history of the party, and they're consuming what it means to be Chinese and what the state says Chinese people should be proud of, but they're doing it for their own personal kind of reasons. There's a sort of articulation between what the state wants and what they are going for. So, there's a couple of things that I just wanted to maybe look at first. So there was some advertising issues. So this is another area that I begin to see, right, how is business being mobilized in service of the state? This is a bit of an odd one. So what I'm going to do, I've got about 4 or 5 of these commercials, but I'm only going to show 2 because it should get the message across. So the first one I'm going to show, I think I saw, it's about 2015, 2016 when these came out, both of these commercials, both of these pieces of video. And the first one I'm going to show you is actually it's from the propaganda department. And just to give you an idea of what types of message we see. So it's not PLA soldiers saluting with the sort of Chinese flag waving in the background. We tend not to see too much of that anymore, particularly outside Beijing. So I'll show you that one, and then there's a second video I want us to have a quick look at. So I'll just explain the context for this first video. So it is called, I think it's called After 63 Years Reunion, I think is the title of the video. And what we see is, I think we start off in Taipei, and we see an old guy, and he's telling his granddaughter to write out red envelopes. And so these are gifts with cash in them that you give to young family members at Spring Festival. And then he says to her, write another one, write another red envelope. And she asks her granddad, who's it for? And he's like, oh, shut up, don't ask, this sort of thing. And then we cut to Shanghai, and we see something else going on, okay? And you sort of see what's going on. There's a sort of family reunion coming up. So let's have a look and see what you think of this. Because this is the style that we see of propaganda in contemporary China. So I think it's 2015 or 2016. Let me have a look. Okay, so we're starting off, and we're starting in Taipei.
小平啊，爷爷的红包写好了没啊？
总共20个，对不对？
再帮我准备一个。
要给谁啊？
So this is us now cut to Shanghai. Okay, so I apologize that I haven't got any English subtitles for this, so I'll just explain a little bit more clearly what's going on here. So we have a brother in Taipei, and he returns back to Shanghai. We see his elder brother, I think it's his elder brother that's in Shanghai, and he's preparing, I think it's dongpo, it's a famous Shanghainese dish. I find it interesting that Taiwan returns to mainland. That, I think, is probably very deliberate, right? And then we see, so there's nothing in here that's about politics, but there's things here about identity. There's a lot of symbolic things going on here. Arya is on the sign. When he sees his brother, he says "Ago," which is "Gaga" in Shanghai Hua, I think, in Shanghainese. So, and this is obviously a Spring Festival commercial, a bit like the sort of John Lewis, but this is from the propaganda department. There's a whole series of these. So I'm going to show you just very quickly another one. Slightly different style, but let's just see which one you think is maybe more effective. So there is subtitles on this one.
西班牙一直都是我特别梦想去的地方。带着媳妇儿，带着孩子，到处转转。在学校里玩，就是《奔跑吧兄弟》里边的那个撕名牌。这么长时间，不知道该怎么去相处。这么长时间估计聊了，估计有10天差不多就够了。
女儿呢从小就喜欢听我拉小提琴，所以呢我会天天拉给她听，她非常可爱。
我到他的工作的他这个地方呢，我看他到底是怎么工作的。
弥补一下我们对他所少做的那些东西。
干我们烹饪这一行，起早贪黑的，但是因为自己喜欢嘛，所以辛苦点也无所谓。
来北京就想赚钱学习摄影，刚赚的1万多块钱学费，前段时间把人家客户的东西弄丢了，我把脾气有点大，还不知道怎么跟他们说了。
今年有个比赛嘛，不努力拿不到好的名次。我从地勤转到空乘以后，我妈就变得特别唠叨，还经常劝我转行什么的。我不愿意跟他们多聊这个事儿。
没告诉他，就是我做快递员这个事儿，跟他们说我是摄影师嘛。
我特希望我妈就是做错事儿别当众就是说我，你能经常来看看我。
又来了，天津女儿，你们看她寄的东西，寄了好几年了，每天都寄，每天都寄，几点起飞，几点着陆，天天就说的这个女儿。
因为你老不在身边，你偶尔回来呢，妈妈就不知道怎么去表达对你的爱。
爸爸妈妈很亏欠。
他做么干，他也是为了这个前途。
也给机会嘛，
Okay, so that got a bit of a laugh. Okay, that's what I was kind of hoping for. So there's something very interesting going on here. I'm not going to show any more of these, running out of obviously time. But what we're seeing is that there is very little difference between state propaganda messages and what we're seeing from advertisers. And I can show you loads. I can show you Nike, I can show you Apple, I can show you lots of Chinese companies. I've got a big bank of all of these advertising. We're doing a bit of semiotic analysis on this. It's just something that I need to bring up to date, I think. But what we're seeing here is this a case of the companies themselves deliberately gearing their messages towards the type of messages we see in state propaganda campaigns? And I would say no. Because we do see this before. What we don't see before sort of 2014, 2013 is propaganda campaigns with this type of message. It's much more sort of forceful, hold high the red banner of socialism sort of stuff. And that's something that we've seen really take off in the Xi Jinping new era, is that they seem to be expanding their message to incorporate common sense notions of what it means to be Chinese and what good people do and this type of thing. So, but one of the issues, whether this is deliberate or not, I'm not sure whether this particular aspect is deliberate, but it makes it almost impossible to distinguish messages that are coming from the state and messages from those messages that are coming from the private sector. They're almost identical in a lot of cases. And that seems to be quite a sort of powerful way of communicating. So that, you know, if you're unable to distinguish, I mean, and this happened to me. I was watching this commercial. I was in a hurry to get to work, and I jumped in a taxi instead of taking the subway. And on the back of the taxi seats in Shanghai, there's these little screens. And I was watching this, and I was thinking, Jesus, it's getting really good, this propaganda. And then the Coca-Cola bottle spins around in the air. I'm like, whoa, I've got to go and research this now and sort of look into this. Is this something we're seeing happening elsewhere? And it's, I just find this fascinating that it seems to me that we're seeing the state, we're seeing CSR strategies developed to contribute to economic policies. We're seeing entrepreneurs being chastised if they don't conduct themselves in a way that upholds the core socialist values. We're seeing industries effectively being created with top-down, very clearly guided policies like the football plan, like red tourism. And then we're also seeing advertising being almost co-opted through a very through what I've called the sophistication of Chinese propaganda, so that it becomes increasingly difficult for us to tell the difference. So, and this is, I hope this is kind of making sense, because it confuses the hell out of me at times as well. But what I'm trying to sort of get to is that the corporate activity and consumerism, these seem to be spaces where people perform their citizenship, whether they go to work, you know, they learn about it through schools, through family, through however, but how they perform it and how they show other people that they're a good citizen seems to be through what they're buying, where they're going, who they're, you know, what services they're using, what brands are they buying. Certain brands have very close allegiances. You look at Apple sales over the last 5 years since Trump brought in import barriers, and they go up and down depending on what the Sino-US discussions were like at that particular point in time. And it's exactly the opposite with Huawei. So you see people buying Huawei phones because they want to show that they're on side with the state. So there's this kind of sort of patriotic consumption that quite a few scholars sort of written on over the last couple of years as well. So this whole arena seems to be something that's really interesting. There was another argument I was going to include on something I call a sort of trilemma for foreign companies, but I think that would take too long for me to sort of go into. So I'm just going to very quickly just wrap this up. So what I'm trying to sort of argue here is that we have this, if we go back to our conventional thinking, is we have this primary responsibility to make money for companies to ensure that they are legislatively and regulatory compliant, that they're not breaking any laws. Only then can they decide, using their sort of autonomy, a strategy to become a more ethical and therefore more attractive company. And then perhaps after that, we'll see philanthropic initiatives that aim to demonstrate even further what a wonderful, good corporate citizen we are. This seems to be flipped in China, or this is what the argument that I'm sort of trying to sort of move towards, or trying to figure out in my own head. So what we see is it's almost upside down the other way. Philanthropy is a visible demonstration of fealty. It reflects state initiatives such as poverty alleviation, morality campaigns, good citizenship, education initiatives in poor rural areas. This is what any philanthropic initiatives seem to contribute towards specific state policies like common prosperity. Whether you're ethical or not, as corporations, it depends on how well and how carefully and clearly you've aligned your corporate values and conduct with these prevailing morality campaigns, including the core socialist values. So whether you're an ethical company has nothing to do with whether you and your board members or your senior management team think you're ethical. It's whether the state, as the primary stakeholder in all private sector companies, thinks that you are. If you demonstrate your fealty through philanthropy, if you carefully manage your sort of ethical, publicly ethical profile, make sure that you're conforming to those, you will then not likely break the law. But if you are operating in an unethical way, given the way that the core socialist values, which was incorporated into the Constitution of the People's Republic of China in 2018, it now also features almost universally in any sort of corporate legislation. It's usually somewhere between Article 3 and Article 10 that, you know, companies creating online content must do so in a way that reflects the core socialist values. There's actually legislation backing this up. So if you're not operating in a way that the state deems is in compliance with the core socialist values, you may well find yourself breaking the law. And those laws are a bit open to interpretation for the authorities to enforce in ways that are maybe useful for them to do so, shall we say. They're not open to interpretation so that you can defend yourself. And if you break these laws or you deem to be unethical, you won't be allowed to make any money. It's very, very simple. This is the political capital aspect. What you're doing is building political capital here so that you will have access to the opportunities made available by the state. So this I think there's something in this argument. I do need to figure it out. What I'm thinking is that all these different threads might form articles over the next, some of them are already out, the football and the red tourism stuff. But there's other things that I need to look at. And I think maybe this is bringing them together into a sort of coherent argument. That's what I'm going to try and do anyway. So thank you for your time. If anybody does want to read more, these are some of the articles that I'm referring to. So there's a couple of think tank pieces at the top, and then there's a couple of journal articles here. If anybody does want those, let me know, I can send them to you. I'm sure you have access here at Cambridge to all these journals and things. Sometimes we have a problem with that at my universities. We don't have access to every single journal that we want. So there's a bit more of a sort of elaborate arguments going on there with these types of things. So thank you for your time. Much appreciate it. And thank you, Bill, for inviting me here. It's very nice to be invited to Cambridge. It's definitely a bucket list thing that I can tick off now. So I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't want to step on the question time too much because we don't have that much time left for questions. I will just say something really quickly, though, a couple of things. The first is that I think this periodization into the three different time periods and the way you've characterized what's driving it in the sort of ideological discussion as well as specific policy areas is probably the clearest such periodization I've seen from anybody recently, at least. I think there's quite a bit there. I also think that all of these different strands together, it's more than one or two articles. You could easily have a book.
That's what I'm maybe moving towards with this.
And so I think that would be really useful to look at. On the red tourism, I would just say about 10 years ago, I had a really interesting experience. One other thing about red tourism actually is Xintiandi, before it was sold out to the Hong Kong developers, Li Ka-shing and all these other people, was actually a working class neighborhood for decades in the old French concession, and was really kind of attractive and pleasant this way, and befitting of the founding site of the Communist Party. Now it's kind of ridiculous. The Communist Party founding museum in the middle of a garish shopping mall. And it's almost jarring.
I never got to see it before it was transformed to that.
Yeah, it was about 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
The whole thing changed. Maybe even a bit later than that. So that's one thing. The other thing about red tourism was about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Lushan in northern part of Jiangxi province, which was where famous conferences took place and so on. And it was in the summertime. It was very, very hot. And I was with a group of political science colleagues from elsewhere in China. And what we noticed, we were talking about sort of as we were going up the mountain, talking about sort of different perceptions of politics around Lushan among people born in the 70s versus born in the 60s, which was all of us, basically. And then we were starting to notice, well, all these people seem to be younger than us who are visiting the site, which surprised us. None of us anticipated that.
It surprised me when I saw the statistics.
And so that rings true. The other thing is it was hot. And so inside the indoor buildings, or inside the buildings, was even hotter. And it was crowded, and it was up on the mountain, so outside was a bit fresh. Inside the buildings, we thought was fantastic. They had Peng Dehuai's letter to Mao was framed with all the handwritten notes, and we were looking at it trying to figure out what did he actually write in all the margins, and they had all the meeting rooms set up exactly as they were during the Congress, and see who sat where, and all that. None of the young people were interested in that. They were all congregating outside playing with phones.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is it. It's just like, can we go back to the hotel now? The buffet is going to start at 5, and it's a really good buffet at the whatever hotel we're staying at.
So all of that rings completely true. But in terms of questions, let me just pose 2 small questions to you, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. Okay. You don't have to answer them now if you don't want, if it's too long. But one was, in these different periods, as you laid it out, there's an interesting sort of interregnum period that you say, could go all the way to 81 or 82, or could be shorter, but it is basically this era of Huaguofeng. And people often pass over that in other areas of politics too. But actually, when it comes to firms, and in that period we're talking about state-owned firms almost exclusively, but Huaguofeng really does try to come up with a new framework for how the state should relate to firms. When he talks about the super comprehensive 10-year plan, right? Because Huaguofeng was about Mao, but bigger, right? The 2 whatevers, and let's go even bigger than the 5-year plan with the 10-year plan, and study Daqing and all of these kind of new campaigns that he was putting into place, and trying to reinvigorate that tie between state and firm, and redefine what the firm was in this new kind of economic reality long after the Great Leap Forward, long after the first 5-year plan, after all of these things have changed. What do we do? And so I wonder, how does that fit in with the periods and also with other things? The second question, just really quickly, is on this issue of consumerism versus corporate consumerism. So people like Karl Gerth have talked a lot about consumer culture and the development of consumerism in China spanning into the socialist period from pre-socialist. And then, as you've also highlighted, these aspects of consumerism in conformity with things like the core socialist values and state policies, and the way that the state tries to shape consumer behavior, and the way that people sort of engage in political performance through consumer behavior. And then you talked about some of that with corporations, with the inverted pyramid, and also with the advertisements that you played. Can you disentangle that a little bit? Is there a difference between individual behavior and corporate behavior? Is there a way that the state treats individual consumers and corporate citizens differently? Is there a different dynamic, or is it really sort of a piece with the same idea?
Yeah, so, right, so that second question. So, the first question, Huaguofeng. I have to be quite honest with you. I'm one of these people that is absolutely guilty as charged of not looking at that period. It's missing from the slide. I do point out the interregnum, but I don't mention Huaguofeng as I know some friends of mine who PhDs in Chinese politics were obsessed with Huaguofeng, and think it's the most fascinating, and will tell anybody that you've got to go and sort of look at this in more detail. But it's just not something that I've really looked at. But given what you've told me there, I think I'm going to have to. I think the other thing is, what I will say is that there is a general tendency to sort of look at that opening reform that comes afterwards and say, right, this is suddenly economic shock therapy, and it was incredibly gradual. And it was, we had the dual township village enterprises, we had dual track pricing systems, and there was this sort of release, and really it's from 2001, after the WTO session, that we see real breakneck economic growth. So I have to be honest, it's not something that I've looked at, but I think I'm going to have to, if that's been at some point a debate on party private sector or party corporation relations. The second point is something that I've had a bit of an issue with. So my arrival at looking at consumerism was through looking at advertising, through these types of adverts that I've shown a couple of examples here. And the sort of CSR stuff has become a sort of later interest. It's sort of expanded out from that. And it is entangled, but I think consumerism on its own is such a massive, massive area that it would benefit from being sort of studied separate to that CSR. However, what I will say is that the relationship seems to me to be that the reason the corporate sector and what companies do is important is because that then frames that consumerism. How the legislation affects what they do. And it seems to me that, and I've said this a couple of times in conversations with colleagues, and sort of dismissed it. Well, what are you on about? It's communist China, it's Xi Jinping. And I said, they're not trying to control what people think. They're trying to control what people do. And that's a very different thing. I mean, I have private conversations with so many friends, incredibly critical of the regime, but these are people I've known for 10, 15 years, or family that might just give some off-the-cuff remark at dinner or something like that. You don't hear that as sort of more sort of open sort of social encounters in China. People are very careful what they say. But what they think and how they conduct themselves in public, it's often very different. I mean, that's a survival skill in that system. And I think by controlling companies, they control people, what people do, a lot more. So if you look at football, for example, I gave that example where you're not going to see a lot of rowdy hooligans drinking lager and this type of thing. But what do you see? If you see people doing lots of sort of coordinated claps, this type of thing. They develop their own culture that's peculiar to their football club. But when you support a football club, what you also do is you also support the national team. And there's this kind of way that feeds into the establishment of people's identity. Am I a Scouser? I don't think I am. I support Everton Football Club. I support Scotland because of my family sort of history. If it's Scotland versus England, definitely supporting Scotland. But I don't think do I look at myself as a good citizen? No, I don't, but that's my identity. And there's a sort of national identity and a sort of thing tied in with it. That seems to me what's going on with this. What this does is the way that, if you fight at a football match, that is not going to be put on CCTV News. It's not going to be reported anywhere, right? It's going to be censored. But what will be reported and what is allowed to be seen is this sort of examples of good citizenship, of good fandom, of this type of thing. And that is very important when it comes to diachronic change over a long period of time, because it becomes normalized. What young kids are growing up seeing now is they're seeing these sort of consensual and sort of state-approved displays of citizenship through, going to concerts, going to sports games, going on red tourism and touring around Jingaishan and all this type of stuff, and what they're doing in schools and things as well. So I think it's complex, but I think that the relationship is, if you can control the companies through CSR, you're likely going to shape the consumerism that emerges out of it. Maybe that's the way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No worries. I wonder if we get distracted a little bit by using something like consumerism, because in both cases, consumption's going on. Okay, and what the state has done is incredibly artfully used the affordances of advertising, media, and so on for the purposes of the state to consume a particular kind of identity. You see that very clearly in that first clip that you kind of showed us there. So what you're doing is you're consuming a way of performing the nation. Just as you do through football stuff, just as you do here. And there's a big literature on nation building and sport and that kind of stuff. But what I think the potential kind of distraction is that you don't expect the artfulness of the advertising style, which is actually being used, which we shouldn't be surprised by either, because actually you're talking to a savvy young generation that actually does understand that world, that deep mediatization kind of space. And what the state's actually doing is using that in order to secure the nation in that kind of sense. So I think you can kind of work. I actually feel that the corporate social responsibility interest is interesting, but maybe it's a kind of consumption social responsibility.
That was the original term that I came up with, was consumer social responsibility.
Because you have to consume
or consumer
a way
state
of
apparatus. Consumption state apparatus.
And I'd take the ism off, and I'd keep it on the process of consuming.
Right.
And the question is, what do you consume?
Yes.
So what work is being asked of you?
Yeah.
And once you back out that way, it seems to me that you don't get glued to, which way is the pyramid.
Sure.
And you actually might say that, okay, the West does corporate social responsibility. Try not to use those lenses, or maybe use it as a kind of an opening gambit, but maybe land somewhere else with a slightly different conceptual grammar for yourself.
Right, okay.
That actually opens it up in interesting ways. But that's just my thought.
Thank you. That's really interesting, because there was a similar comment from a colleague who said there's just something that seems to be a bit missing, and it's more about conceptualizing it yourself rather than trying to sort of force it into a pigeonhole of CSR or this type of thing. Yeah.
Rather than look at does it match it or not, it's what does it open up, and then you begin to see where the differences lay, and then maybe the language itself you begin to develop for yourself that doesn't fit the cookie cutter kind of.
Right. Okay. We can definitely have a further conversation on that. That's very interesting.
Other questions? Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I mean, I come in not exactly sure where you're going to, to lead us to with your title, but then you completely wowed me. And won me over. I thought this is brilliant, really fun, and theoretical, empirical, you nailed it, and really going down into grassroots China as well. So I really appreciate your presentation.
All right, thank you very much. That's very nice to hear.
Thank you very much. Couple of questions for you. So you outlined, repressive apparatus, ideological apparatus, and the consumer apparatus. So my first question is how these three things actually interact and link together. So one possibility is really how, ideological indoctrination, bring it all or weave them all together. And the other thing I was thinking, and I haven't heard as much from you, but I know this is just, a snapshot of your project, is the whole idea of national security, which Xi Jinping is so big on. How does it fit inside? He said, securitization is across the policy spectrum, across everything the government does. So presumably, in morality, traditional Chinese socialist values, or traditional Chinese value that now becomes socialist. How does national security fit in?
Right.
Now, and another thing, coming in from this part of the world, when we look at propaganda video that make you feel a bit touchy and or teary and so on.
I've had people crying to these videos. I've shown a few in the row, and they don't realise that they're propaganda.
I mean, they're very effective.
Yeah, they're very, very effective.
But you see, the thing is, then I was thinking, look, this is the same propaganda department that will be producing videos of Uyghur people dancing in the square that look extremely forced.
Yes.
But this is the same department that will produce really effective video that make people want to cry. So how do we put together, the two phases of Chinese propaganda? One of it being, very heavy-handed, coercive, and clearly it's political messaging. You have to listen or don't ask questions. And the other being a lot more relatable. How do you put these two phases together in your research?
But I think that is the massively important question, is that when you know something is coming to you from the propaganda department, it's very difficult to not be cynical about it, right? So even, and that's why I love this particular series for the Taiwanese reunion one. There's a series about, I think it's about 4 or 5 of them, and they're just wonderfully effective. And each one of them targets a different subsection. So you've got migrant workers, you've got the elderly separated by the sort of, the Civil War. You've got this sort of middle-class entrepreneurs. You've got these different groups that are represented, but all of the messages are very, very sort of similar, and they all resonate to a certain level with very sort of key sort of values of, you know, family and this type of thing, right? But if you know that that's coming from the propaganda department, you can be cynical about it. And this is what I think is so effective about this mechanism, is that when you see it coming through Coca-Cola commercials, or, you know, advertising, or, you know, events marketing or experiential marketing that we see a lot of in China now, you don't question it because it's not from the propaganda department. The messages are so very similar. And what it seems to me that the CCP propaganda department is doing is it's not really, what it's doing is it's laying out the doctrine, but that doctrine has been expanded to incorporate the types of messages we see in commercial advertising. Because those advertisers are trying to send messages that resonate with their customer base, right? So by expanding out that sort of range of interest to talk about what it means to be Chinese, about moral values, about being a good citizen, this type of thing, they've actually sort of co-opted a sort of channel of getting these messages to people without them knowing they're coming, they're sort of coming from the government. So it's a really interesting sort of dynamic. So, but I agree with you, most of it's very clumsy. You get a lot of stuff that's very clumsy. The other thing that I have a particular bee in my bonnet about is that a lot of the time in Western scholarship on China, the word propaganda is just literally a catch-all term to specifically, a catch-all term to say any communication that comes out of China that we disagree with, whether it's from the government or not, whether it's from, you know, somebody else you're talking to or somebody online. And I tried to do this in this piece on consuming the party history, is make this distinction that we do still get a lot of propaganda. That is very clearly thought out arguments that talk to a single person and try to persuade them with that sort of reason and logic. But what we're seeing much more extensively is more agitation and very sophisticated agitprop. And when we say agitation, it's about getting an emotional response. It's not necessarily making people angry, but making people sad, making people laugh, making people feel like they're part of something bigger. You know, it's about that emotional response, and it's about targeting a mass audience. And this is where we've seen a huge sort of change over the last sort of few years. And that's what I mean by that sort of sophistication of propaganda. It's, these terms came from Plekhanov, right? That sort of distinction. It was it was Lenin, and he talks about Plekhanov saying that these are the distinctions between propaganda and agitation. You're talking to one person with propaganda, you're talking to many with agitation, trying to get a rabble-rousing sort of reaction from them, make them angry. But the other fascinating thing here is that the state here is not trying to overthrow a government, the Tsarist regime. It's trying to reinforce and galvanize its own position. So it's being used for a very different purpose. So the emotions that we see are generally not anger or rage or, you know, despondency, but are much more sort of positive. And that's what we tend to see through these propaganda campaigns. So it's really, really, really interesting to look at. And that's really what I originally got interested in, was looking at these commercials. I was just thinking, what's going on here? Why are the messages so similar? My original sort of suspicion was that the marketing executives are sort of taking a lead from the propaganda campaigns, but I don't think that's the case at all, really. The advertising hasn't changed, the propaganda has, and it's become quite a sort of powerful thing. But I think that's the main thing. When it comes from the propaganda department, we recognize it and we can dismiss it. But when it comes through advertising, we're less quick to dismiss that. We sort of the idea of dismissing it doesn't even sort of occur to us, because it comes from I wouldn't say a trusted source, but a source that we think we know better about. Yeah. Cool.
In the interest of time, maybe what we should do is take a bank of like 3 questions and then give him a chance to respond. So if there's...
I want to ask you about this football, since you mentioned it.
Right, okay.
So certainly that's something that it's not really working in China,
No.
right? So what can you tell us about?
Right, so, okay, so do a bank of questions, okay? So we've got a football plan.
Football.
Yeah.
Questions that people have? Perhaps that's the only question from the floor. Okay, so...
Okay, I can say, does that mean I can have more time? Because that's quite a difficult one to answer.
Yeah.
3 quarters of time.
Yeah. So what we see is in the early part of the first administration of Xi Jinping, so 2012 to 2017, we see this plan emerge for the medium to long-term football development plan, which aims to build China into a world footballing power by 2050.
That's when Xi Jinping went on TV and played football. With,
Well,
the
there's this photo that goes around that
Yeah.
always gets sort of like Xi Jinping loves football, and there's a picture of him kicking a football in the air. But he was actually in Ireland. It's Gaelic football. It wasn't even football he was playing with that sort of picture. So when he came to the UK, he famously went to Man City with David Cameron, and there was a selfie with Sergio Aguero, the Argentinian player, and this type of thing. Does Xi Jinping like football? I don't know. I don't really care. I don't think he probably does. I think what they see is that sport and team sports are particularly strong way to see very vibrant displays of national sovereignty. And this is why they want it. In this article here, where was it? This one I wrote with John and Simon. So they came to me with a project. And so we're looking at analysing the sort of football development that's going on in China. I said, okay, but I think they sent me a draft of stuff. And I said, I don't know how I can get involved in some of this because it's more talking about the outward international acquisitions of companies like Wanda buying Atletico Madrid. And I don't really know anything about that. But on the domestic front, I think you could do a detailed analysis of this plan. So that was my sort of contribution to it. And we introduced a sort of key concept here was Bourdieu's concept of symbolic capital and symbolic violence, which kind of monopolized by the state. So the ability of the state to consecrate groups according to their qualities. So if you want to be considered, I'm trying to think of an example here. So if you want to be considered a woman, you have to, in any given society, there are certain different societies have different sort of benchmarks of what's the correct behavior for being a woman. If you step outside of those, you might be sort of ostracized or what have you. And what they're doing with sport is they're kind of sort of setting down this consecration of what it means to be a good citizen. Somebody that supports their local team, somebody goes there but behaves in a way that we want to see them behave, but also supports the national team. And this idea that, it's difficult with sports that China's traditionally been good at. Loads of people watch the Olympics, but it's not this kind of boisterous kind of nation versus nation power dynamics that are going on there either. So it seems to me that that's really what it's about. It's about consensus, trying to get people to perform this sort of way and to buy into that. But it's divided into 3 clear strategies, and this is where a lot of the reporting in the common press, I think, gets it wrong. It's saying China wants to win a World Cup by 2050. That's not in the. They don't want to win. They may want to win a World Cup, but they don't clearly state that, and it's not an objective of the plan. What they want is a developed football industry. The first part is about laying the groundwork by setting up associations, these types of things. The second middle part is really about expanding massively pitches, campus football leagues. It's about, and they're trying to get this sort of organic grassroots stuff going on. And then the third part is really about developing the elite and the men's national team and getting them to perform on the world stage. So the professional sports part, according to the plan, isn't even going to kick into place for another 10 years. They're not even concerning themselves with these things until 2035. So we have 2016 to 2020, basic planning. 2020 to 2035, and then 2035 to 2050. That's roughly the short, medium, and long term of the plan. What's going bad at the moment is concentrated at the top of China's General Sports Administration, the Chinese FA, and the men's national team. The other thing that we've seen is the bankruptcy of a lot of football clubs in the Chinese Super League, and then who have been relegated down and then they've been dissolved and they're liquidated. Now that has been very embarrassing because that's the most visible element. But what's happened there, what seems to have happened there, is that a lot of these entrepreneurs, we're talking about people like, the Wanda chairman from Dalian, we're talking about Dai Yongge, who's in all sorts of problems with Reading Football Club at the moment here in the UK. And Hongda, sort of Xu Jiayin in Guangzhou, they piled loads of money into this stuff. But then once their companies have started running into money, it looks to me like their wealth has sort of evaporated and they are now unable to put that money in or unwilling to put that money in. Jiangsu Suning went bankrupt shortly after the CEO of that company, who I believe is now in prison, put lots of Suning's money to prop up Evergrande in about 2020. Other people that put money in 2020, Jack Ma, Pony Ma, it's like 14 investors that put 23.5 billion Hong Kong dollars into Evergrande. Now, if that money's all going into Evergrande to keep it propped up, it's not going into football. And this seems to me what the problem is. So this is maybe not a problem with football per se. It's symptomatic of the wider malaise in the Chinese property market that seems to be a big problem for the Xi administration at the moment.
Actually, about the football, two other questions immediately sprung to mind as you were just talking about it. One is, whatever happened to basketball? Right? Basketball was the big thing.
That's the campus sport, yeah.
15, 20, 30 years ago even, and that seems to have had a huge run for a long time and now be petering out because football is replacing it. But the second question is, China, like the United States actually, has long been much more competitive internationally in women's football than men's football. Is that being completely neglected? Or is that an area where they might actually have better...
women's football is all part of this medium long-term football plan. It's not neglected at all. It's always historically been much further ahead. The Chinese women's national team has had some incredibly successful periods throughout its history. But in terms of the amateur game, in terms of campus leagues, that's all being developed at the same time. But women's professional football in China doesn't have the same profile as the CSL. Come back to your question on basketball. There was so this was one of the things we're going to talk about, foreign brands. So we've got Gap, we've got Mercedes, we've got the Houston Rockets. So the Houston Rockets got into a lot of hot water about 2-3 years ago, just before COVID, I think it was. And there was a tour that went out, and the chairman of the Houston Rockets defended an NBA player who had criticized China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. I think that's something to do with that anyway. And then there was this tour going on at the time, and so it was LeBron James. But this is an interesting piece. So we've got LeBron James sort of kowtowing. We've got Tim Cook, and this is Christian Dior. They're all kowtowing to the Chinese regime. And we've seen a lot of these scandals where these companies are not required to adhere to the core socialist values. But if they want to access this market, they have got to make sure that they do not hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, according to the PRC authorities. So this was a big scandal. Gap, this shirt wasn't even sold in China, but because it did not include Taiwan, everybody went absolutely ballistic, and they had to remove this, and Gap had to apologize. Mercedes, quoting the Dalai Lama, did not go down too well in their marketing campaign, even though this marketing campaign wasn't even seen on the mainland. But it was something that usually it's not the authorities that pick this stuff up. It's netizens go ballistic at this stuff, and then they have to sort of step in. And there was another issue with Marriott and the Marriott hotels and the Free Tibet Society. And this was the Houston Rockets that had to climb down. But what happened here was basically overnight the authorities just shut off all coverage of the NBA. You couldn't access any games. They withdrew them from TV and put on alternative programming and this type of thing. So this is a bit of an issue, and this is that sort of last part I didn't cover today, is that there seems to be a bit of there's a bit of a difficulty for foreign firms operating in China. Somewhere they are going to be compromised either on the money that they can make, on whether they are operating legally, or whether they are breaking their own ethical code back home, their own ethical commitments back home. It seems to me that you can have two of these, but risks are going to emerge in the third, and that's what the trilemma is. So this is another part of the argument that I need to think about a bit more carefully. But it's a kind of a side dish to the to the stuff I'm really more interested in. So I don't know. It's still massively popular, but it is the NBA that's popular. There's no
Chinese
national plan to
league.
build.
They were good 25 years ago, the Chinese national leagues, and then they've in basketball, but then they've diminished.
I'm not sure. I think it's maybe something to do with scale, and it's maybe something to do with the fact that there is no World Cup for basketball. This is an American sport that does not put China on a world stage and does not show, hordes of.
But Mike, you also think that football stadiums are huge infrastructures, and so if you want to kind of deal with overproduction of infrastructure, which is less likely built on road stuff, then if you're thinking, and there's a limited number of airports you can kind of build, then actually stadium infrastructure.
The stadium, the five-star hotels. I mean, and this is exactly all the entrepreneurs that came in and bought up these football clubs did it for exactly that reason. And you look at even in Madrid, Wanda Plaza, the Atletico Madrid is named after the Chinese company that bought out and not only built the stadium, but all the sort of commercial infrastructure that around that is all owned by these. And that's what we see. Where I was living in Suzhou, they built massive, huge sports stadia about 500 meters from our apartment block. It wasn't finished by the time I left, but it's ice rinks, hockey rinks, 5-star, 2 or 3, 4, 5-star hotels, shopping malls, just tons of stuff to go on. And that's how do they get planning permission for that? Well, they've got to buy the football team that allows them to get the rights granted from the local government and this type of thing. So that political capital, by buying into these projects, allows them to do what they're really after, which is, building these very maybe not profitable, but inflating land values and then speculating and flipping them and making the money that way. So.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for excellent talk and excellent questions.